I have always believed that a home is more than just where you live. It is a reflection of who you are. For 5 years, I had poured my heart and soul into making my modest suburban house into something special. The lawn was my particular pride and joy. Not because I was competing with the neighbors, but because there was something deeply satisfying about creating a beautiful outdoor space with my own 2 hands. Every Saturday morning followed the same ritual. I would wake up early, brew a strong cup of coffee, and head outside while dew still clung to each blade of grass. The neighborhood would be quiet, with only the occasional jogger passing by with a friendly wave. I would trim, weed, and tend to my growing collection of native plants that lined the garden beds. These plants were not just decorative. They were carefully selected to thrive in our climate without excessive watering or chemical treatments. Maple Hills was a pleasant community of about 200 homes. The houses were not mansions by any means, but they were well maintained and represented the investment of hardworking families. Most of my neighbors were friendly enough. We would exchange pleasantries at the mailbox or while walking dogs in the evening. There was a sense of mutual respect about property boundaries and noise levels that made living here comfortable. Of course, like any planned community, we had a homeowners association. The HOA collected monthly dues to maintain common areas, organize seasonal events, and ensure property values remained stable. Most residents viewed the HOA as a necessary formality. The quarterly meetings were sparsely attended, and the rulebook was reasonably sensible. Basic guidelines about exterior paint colors, holiday decorations, and lawn maintenance were enforced with gentle reminders rather than harsh penalties. That is, until Karen Williams joined the board. Karen had moved to Maple Hills about 2 years after me. From the beginning, something about her felt off. While most neighbors would smile and wave, Karen would study your property with narrowed eyes, as if mentally cataloging violations. Her own yard was immaculate in a sterile, impersonal way that spoke more of rigid control than genuine care. It was all sharp edges and not a leaf out of place. When she ran for the HOA board, her campaign focused on maintaining standards and protecting investments. Only 20 residents showed up to vote, and Karen won a seat by a 3-vote margin. I did not think much of it at the time. That was my first mistake. I continued with my weekend gardening, adding a small rock garden that summer and extending one of the flower beds with drought-resistant blooms. I was particularly proud of how it all came together, natural yet well-tended. Several neighbors even asked for advice on their own landscaping projects. One evening, as I was watering some new plantings, I noticed a silver sedan driving slowly past my house. Behind the wheel was Karen, notebook in hand, face set in concentration. She did not acknowledge my wave. Instead, she scribbled something down and drove away. A strange feeling settled in my stomach. Something told me that my peaceful days of quiet gardening might soon be coming to an end. If only I had known how right that feeling would prove to be. The first notice arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. I found it tucked into my door frame when I returned from work. The paper was crisp white with the HOA logo prominently displayed at the top. Courtesy, Notice of Violation, was printed in bold letters across the header. According to the form, my front yard violated Section 7.3 of the community bylaws regarding overgrowth and unsightly vegetation. I stood in my driveway, looking at my yard in confusion. Everything appeared exactly as it had for months. The grass was neatly trimmed. The garden beds were free of weeds. My native plants were thriving but certainly not overgrown. The rock garden was perfectly arranged. Nothing seemed amiss or different from any other well-maintained yard on the street. Nevertheless, I took the notice seriously. That evening, I pulled out the community rulebook that had been gathering dust in my desk drawer. Section 7.3 stated that all vegetation must be maintained in a neat and orderly fashion, with lawn areas not exceeding 4 inches in height. Non-standard landscaping features must be approved by the board. The language was vague enough to be interpreted in multiple ways. To be safe, I spent that weekend giving my yard extra attention. I trimmed back some of the native grasses that might have been approaching the 4-inch limit. I added fresh mulch to the garden beds and removed a few stones from the rock garden that might have shifted out of place. By Sunday evening, my yard looked magazine perfect. 2 weeks passed without incident. I began to think the notice had been a simple misunderstanding. Then the second letter arrived. This one was not tucked into my door but sent via certified mail. The envelope required my signature for delivery, giving it an ominous formality. This second notice cited the same violation, but included additional language about continued noncompliance and potential fines. It stated that I had failed to address the issues identified in the previous communication. A fine of $100 had been assessed to my account, with additional penalties to follow if the situation remained unresolved within 10 days. I was no longer confused. I was angry. I had complied fully with the first notice despite not understanding what violation I had supposedly committed. Now I was being penalized again for the same nonspecific infraction. That evening, I walked around the neighborhood, studying other yards. Several had far less maintenance than mine. Some had browning grass or actual weeds sprouting along the edges, yet these homes had no violation notices on their doors. The next day, I ran into my neighbor Robert while retrieving my mail. Robert had lived in Maple Hills since the community was first built. I could not help but notice the certified letter, Robert said, his voice lowered despite no one else being around. Let me guess, lawn violation. When I nodded, he sighed. Karen has been on a crusade since joining the board. You are not the first. Last month it was the Patels because of their vegetable garden. Before that, she targeted the Johnsons over their rock border. But why? I asked. My yard follows all the guidelines. Robert glanced down the street toward Karen's house. Some people just need to exercise power. Watch yourself with her. She does not back down easily. That night, I composed a carefully worded email to the entire HOA board. I attached dated photographs of my yard from before and after the first notice. I cited the relevant bylaw sections and requested clarification on exactly what violations needed addressing. The tone was respectful but firm. The response came solely from Karen, not the full board as I had hoped. Her email dismissed my concerns and photos as irrelevant to the current state of violations. She mentioned multiple complaints from neighbors, but provided no specifics when I asked who had complained or what about. 3 days later, the final warning arrived. This one was printed on bright red paper and delivered by a process server. It stated that if the violations were not corrected within 72 hours, the HOA would exercise its right to take corrective action at the homeowner's expense. The estimated cost for such action was listed as $1,500 to $3,000. As I stood holding that red paper, watching the process server drive away, I knew this had moved beyond a simple neighborhood dispute. This was something personal, something targeted, and I had no idea why Karen Williams had set her sights on me. Tuesday had been a particularly grueling day at the office. 3 meetings back-to-back followed by a system crash that required 2 extra hours of troubleshooting. All I wanted was to get home, change into comfortable clothes, and relax on my back patio with a cold drink. The red warning notice had been delivered on Friday, meaning the 72-hour deadline had expired the previous day. I had sent another email to the full board but received no response. As I turned onto my street, the first thing I noticed was the large truck parked in front of my house. The side panel read Green Valley Landscaping in faded green letters. Behind it was a smaller pickup truck loaded with equipment. My heart began pounding against my ribs as I accelerated toward my driveway. The scene that greeted me was one of systematic destruction. 3 men in work uniforms were methodically tearing up my front yard. One operated a small excavator that was digging up the garden beds I had so carefully cultivated. Another was pulling up my sprinkler system, tossing the components into a pile like garbage. The third was removing the rock garden, dumping the stones into a wheelbarrow. I leaped from my car, not even bothering to close the door behind me. "Stop! Stop what you are doing right now." The workers paused, looking confused. The oldest of them, a weathered man in his 50s who appeared to be the foreman, approached me with a clipboard in hand. "Are you the homeowner?" he asked, his voice matter of fact. "Yes, this is my property and you are destroying it," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. "Who authorized this?" The foreman flipped through some papers on his clipboard. "We have a work order from the Maple Hills Homeowners Association, signed by the board secretary, Karen Williams. Everything is in order. We are contracted to remove non-compliant landscaping features and replace them with standard sod." He handed me a copy of the work order. There it was in black and white. Authorization to completely redesign my front yard according to standard community guidelines. Karen's signature was bold at the bottom of the page. "This is illegal," I said, pulling out my phone. "I never received proper notification for this specific action. I am calling the HOA office right now." The call went straight to voicemail. I tried 3 more times with the same result. Meanwhile, the workers had resumed their destruction, clearly uncomfortable but following their orders. "Please, you have to stop," I pleaded with the foreman. "This is a mistake. At least let me speak with someone from the board." "Sorry, sir," he replied, genuine sympathy in his eyes. "We have a contract. If we do not complete the job, we do not get paid. You need to take this up with your HOA." I was about to call the police when I heard someone calling my name. It was my neighbor Lisa from across the street, hurrying over with her phone in hand. "I saw what was happening when I got home from work," she said breathlessly. "I have video from earlier. You need to see this." Lisa held up her phone, showing footage she had taken from her living room window about 2 hours earlier. There was Karen Williams, pointing at different areas of my yard while giving instructions to the foreman. Her body language was animated, almost excited. At one point, she actually smiled as she made a sweeping gesture across the entirety of my front yard. "She was here personally directing them," Lisa said, her voice low. "I thought you must have had some major violation or something, but this seems excessive." By now, several other neighbors had gathered at the edges of my property, watching the destruction with expressions ranging from curiosity to concern. I felt a burning mixture of anger, helplessness, and humiliation. When the police finally arrived 30 minutes later, they listened to my explanation with professional detachment. The officer reviewed the HOA documentation provided by the landscapers and shook his head. "Unfortunately, sir, this appears to be a civil matter between you and your homeowners association," he explained. "The workers have documentation authorizing their presence and work. I suggest you contact an attorney if you believe proper procedures were not followed." By the time the landscaping crew left that evening, the sun was setting over a scene of complete devastation. Where my carefully tended native garden had stood that morning, there was now only churned earth and debris. My sprinkler system had been completely dismantled, pipes jutting from the ground like broken bones. The rock garden was gone, leaving an empty depression in the soil. I walked the perimeter of the destruction in a daze, taking photos with trembling hands. 5 years of work, thousands of dollars in plants and materials, countless hours of careful tending, all gone in an afternoon. Some of those plants had been gifts from friends. Others had been carefully propagated from cuttings over several seasons. As darkness fell, I sat on my front steps, surveying the wreckage. The damage went far beyond just the visible destruction. The irrigation lines had been cut rather than properly capped. The topsoil had been scraped away, exposing clay that would be difficult to replant. Even the decorative border that marked the property line had been removed. A conservative estimate put the damage at several $1,000s, but the true cost, the time, care, and personal connection I had invested in creating that space, was immeasurable. As I finally went inside, one thought crystallized in my mind. This would not stand. Whatever game Corinne Williams was playing, she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. I slept poorly that night, waking repeatedly with the image of my destroyed yard burned into my consciousness. As the first light of dawn filtered through my bedroom window, I rose, made a strong pot of coffee, and prepared to assess the full extent of the damage. The morning light revealed even greater devastation than had been apparent the previous evening. What struck me most was the methodical nature of the destruction. This was not simple removal. The crew had deliberately damaged infrastructure that would be costly to repair. Irrigation lines were severed at points that would require extensive digging to reconnect. The garden bed borders had been completely removed rather than simply cleared of plants. Even the thin layer of quality topsoil I had gradually built up over the years had been scraped away, leaving hard-packed clay unsuitable for immediate replanting. I spent the next 3 hours documenting everything. I photographed each area of damage from multiple angles, using measuring tape in the shots to show scale. I took video walking the perimeter, narrating specific issues as I encountered them. I created a spreadsheet listing every plant, feature, and system component that had been damaged or removed, along with their approximate value. The total was staggering, well over $7,000 in material costs alone, not counting labor or the years required for plants to mature. While saving these files to my computer, I remembered something important. For the past 2 years, I had maintained a digital garden journal with dated photographs showing the evolution of my landscaping. This would provide crucial evidence of the yard's condition before the destruction. Next, I turned my attention to the HOA bylaws. I had skimmed them before, but now I read every word, making detailed notes. Section 12.4 specifically outlined the process for remedial action on properties. Before undertaking corrective measures on any property, the board must A. Provide written notice of specific violations. B. Allow homeowner minimum 14 days to address cited issues. C. Conduct formal inspection to verify continued noncompliance. D. Vote as a full board to approve specific remedial actions. E. Provide homeowner with detailed scope of intended work no less than 7 days before commencement. I had received vague notices but no specific inspection, no board vote that I was aware of, and certainly no detailed scope of work. Corinne Williams had circumvented the entire process. At 9:00 a.m., I called a lawyer who had been recommended by a colleague. Jonathan Mayer specialized in real estate law, including HOA disputes. His earliest available appointment was at 2, 6:00 p.m. that same day. I took it immediately. While waiting for my appointment, I contacted Green Valley Landscaping, the company that had performed the work. The receptionist was initially reluctant to provide information, but became more helpful when I mentioned potential legal issues with their contract. She confirmed that the work order had come directly from Corinne Williams, not from the full HOA board as required by their own contract terms. She also promised to email me a copy of the work order and invoice. As I prepared to leave for the lawyer's office, my doorbell rang. Outside stood my neighbor Robert, the longtime resident who had warned me about Corinne. "I heard what happened," he said solemnly. "A few of us have been talking. You are not the first, but we hope you might be the last." Robert introduced me to Diane and Michael, residents from the other side of the neighborhood. Over the next hour, they shared their own experiences with Corinne's targeted enforcement. Diane had been cited repeatedly for a children's playhouse that had existed without issue for years before Corinne joined the board. Michael had faced escalating fines over the color of his front door, despite having documentation that the color had been approved by the previous board. "She has a pattern," Michael explained. "She focuses on one homeowner at a time, usually people who have spoken against her or who she perceives as different in some way." "Do you know why she might have targeted me specifically?" I asked. The three exchanged glances before Robert spoke. "Did you vote against her at the last board election?" I nodded, and I questioned the need for increased dues at the quarterly meeting in March. "That would do it," Diane said quietly. Before leaving, they each provided written statements about their experiences with Corinne and the inconsistent enforcement of HOA rules. They also gave me contact information for 4 other homeowners with similar stories. Jonathan Mayer's office was in a modest building near downtown. His reception area featured several framed newspaper articles about successful cases against overzealous HOAs. It felt like a good sign. After reviewing my documentation, Jonathan's initial assessment was not encouraging. "HOA cases are challenging," he explained, leaning back in his chair. "Courts tend to defer to association governance. Unless there are clear violations of the bylaws or state law, judges prefer not to intervene in what they see as private community matters." My heart sank. "So there is nothing I can do?" "I did not say that," Jonathan replied, tapping his pen against my copy of the bylaws. "Based on what you have shown me, there are multiple procedural violations here. The lack of specific notice, no formal inspection, no full board vote, and no advance notification of the scope of work. Also, the landscaping company should not have accepted a work order from an individual board member without proper documentation of board approval." He closed my file and looked at me directly. "I suggest we find someone who specializes even more specifically in HOA litigation. I have a colleague, Sophia Ramirez, who has built her entire practice around these cases. Let me call her." 20 minutes later, I was sitting across from Sophia in a conference room. Her eyes lit up as she reviewed my documentation. "This is textbook overreach," she said, highlighting sections of the bylaws. "Not only did they fail to follow proper procedure, but based on these photos, your landscaping clearly did not violate any objective standards in the first place." She looked up at me with the first real hope I had felt since finding my yard destroyed. "They picked the wrong homeowner to bully. We have a very strong case." The following week moved at an intense pace. Sophia drafted a formal demand letter to the HOA board outlining all procedural violations and demanding compensation for the damage. The document ran to 12 pages, with each paragraph citing specific bylaw sections and including photographic evidence. The final section listed our demands: full restoration of my landscaping to its previous condition, compensation for emotional distress, and immediate review of Corinne Williams' actions by the full board. The letter was delivered by courier to each board member's home address on Monday morning. By that afternoon, my phone was ringing with a call from Thomas Bennett, the board president. "I want you to know that we have called an emergency meeting for Wednesday evening," Thomas said, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone aware they are potentially being recorded. "We would like you to attend and present your concerns to the full board." "Will Corinne Williams be there?" I asked. A pause. "As a board member, yes, she has been notified." "Then I will be bringing my attorney," I replied. Thomas cleared his throat. "That is certainly your right, though we had hoped to handle this matter internally." "That opportunity passed when my property was destroyed without proper authorization," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. "We will see you Wednesday." The meeting was scheduled for 7:00 p.m. in the community center, a small building near the neighborhood entrance typically used for social events and the sparsely attended quarterly meetings. Sophia and I arrived 20 minutes early to find the parking lot already filled with cars. Word had spread throughout the community, and it seemed many residents were curious about the conflict. The meeting room had been arranged with the 5 board members seated at a table facing rows of chairs for residents. At least 30 people were already in attendance, with more filing in behind us. The atmosphere felt charged, filled with whispered conversations that stopped as Sophia and I made our way to seats in the front row. Corinne Williams sat at the far left of the board table, her posture rigid and her expression carefully composed. Next to her was a man in a suit who I assumed was the HOA's attorney. Thomas Bennett occupied the center seat, flanked by the other 3 board members who all seemed uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact with both Corinne and me. At precisely 7:00 p.m., Thomas called the meeting to order. After brief introductions, he announced that the first agenda item was discussion of landscaping enforcement actions at 1842 Maple Drive, my address. "Before we begin," Thomas said, "I want to remind everyone that this is a civil discussion between neighbors. We ask that all comments remain respectful and focused on facts rather than personal attacks." He then invited me to present my concerns. Sophia and I had prepared thoroughly, dividing our presentation into 3 parts. I would explain the situation from my perspective, then Sophia would address the legal violations, and finally, we would present our demands for resolution. I stood conscious of all eyes in the room on me. For 5 years, I have been a responsible homeowner in Maple Hills. I have paid my dues on time, maintained my property, and participated in community events. Until recently, I had no issues with the HOA. I gestured to the large poster boards we had brought, displaying before and after photos of my yard. This was my front yard 2 weeks ago, and this is what it looks like now. Audible gasps came from several residents who had not yet seen the destruction. I continued, describing the escalating notices culminating in the unauthorized demolition. Throughout my account, Corinne maintained her composed expression, occasionally whispering to the attorney beside her. When I finished, Sophia rose and methodically outlined each procedural violation, citing specific sections of the bylaws and state law. She distributed copies of a timeline document to each board member, highlighting the absence of proper notification, inspection, and board approval. "The actions taken against my client constitute a clear breach of HOA governance requirements," Sophia concluded. "Moreover, the targeted nature of these actions, when compared with the lack of enforcement against similar or more severe violations on other properties, raises serious concerns about discriminatory enforcement. Thomas Bennett looked genuinely disturbed. Ms. Williams, as the board secretary who authorized this action, would you care to respond to these allegations? Karen straightened in her chair. Everything I did was within my authority as a board officer. The violations at this property were clearly documented, and the homeowner failed to address them despite multiple notices. Her voice remained steady, almost rehearsed. As for board approval, we discussed problem properties at the April meeting, and the board granted officers discretion to take necessary actions. The HOA attorney leaned forward. While the board did discuss enforcement generally, our minutes do not reflect any specific authorization for this level of intervention at this specific property. Karen's composure flickered for the first time. The authority was implied. We cannot bring every minor enforcement action to a full board vote. Destruction of a homeowner's entire front yard hardly constitutes a minor enforcement action, Sophia interjected. At this point, Robert, my neighbor who had provided a statement, raised his hand to speak. I have attended every board meeting for the past 3 years. There was never any vote authorizing this kind of action against any specific property. Several other longtime residents nodded in agreement. Karen's eyes narrowed as she scanned the room, seemingly surprised by the turnout. The mood shifted when Lisa, the neighbor who had provided the video evidence, stood up. I have something the board should see. She connected her phone to the room's AV system, and suddenly Karen's image appeared on the large screen, directing the landscapers in the destruction of my yard. Her smile as she made a sweeping gesture across my property was unmistakable. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Thomas Bennett's face had grown increasingly grave. He turned to the HOA attorney. Jerry, what are the implications here? The attorney looked uncomfortable. The HOA insurance policy covers board actions taken in accordance with proper procedures. Individual board members acting outside their authority may not be covered for liabilities arising from those unauthorized actions. This statement landed like a bomb in the room. The other board members visibly shifted away from Karen, creating physical distance that mirrored their growing desire for political separation. I think we need to discuss this matter in executive session, Thomas said finally. Would everyone except board members and legal counsel please step outside for a few minutes? The crowd filed out reluctantly. In the hallway, several neighbors approached me with supportive comments and additional stories about Karen's behavior. After about 20 minutes, we were called back in. Thomas Bennett looked 10 years older than he had at the start of the meeting. After consultation with counsel, the board has voted to suspend Karen Williams from her position, pending a full investigation into this matter and other alleged procedural violations. We will be contracting an independent investigator to review all enforcement actions taken in the past year. Karen sat in rigid silence, her lips pressed into a thin line and spots of color high on her cheeks. Thomas continued, "We will be in touch with you and your attorney tomorrow to begin discussions about appropriate remediation for the damage to your property. This meeting is adjourned." As people began to disperse, I caught Karen's eye across the room. For a brief moment, her mask slipped completely, revealing pure hatred before she collected herself and marched out of the room, alone. The following days revealed just how thoroughly Karen had abused her position on the board. The independent investigator hired by the HOA discovered that Karen had been operating a shadow enforcement system, keeping separate records of violations that were never officially filed with the full board. Her personal files contained detailed notes on certain homeowners, including photographs taken without permission and records of their voting positions on various HOA matters. Most damning was the discovery that the landscaping company had not been properly licensed or bonded for the type of work performed on my property. The HOA insurance adjuster, who came to assess the damage, explained that this fact alone created significant liability for the association. The board has a fiduciary duty to verify contractor credentials, he explained as we walked the perimeter of my still devastated yard. Failure to do so constitutes negligence. 2 weeks after the emergency meeting, Sophia and I met with Thomas Bennett, 2 other board members, and the HOA attorney in a conference room at Sophia's office. The atmosphere was tense but respectful. They presented their initial settlement offer, restoration of my yard to community standards plus $2,000 for inconvenience. Sophia smiled politely. That is not going to be adequate. My client is not interested in community standard landscaping. He wants his property restored to its previous condition, which was fully compliant with HOA regulations despite Ms. Williams' claims to the contrary. She slid a folder across the table. This is our counteroffer. Full restoration using the landscaper of my client's choice, following the detailed plans we have provided based on his extensive photo documentation. Compensation for emotional distress in the amount of $10,000. And implementation of new HOA policies requiring documented board approval for any enforcement action beyond written notices. The HOA representatives looked stunned at the figure. The attorney began to object, but Thomas raised his hand. Before we discuss numbers, there is something you should know, he said gravely. Our investigation has uncovered, let us call it a history between you and Corinne Williams. This was news to me. What kind of history? I barely knew her before she joined the board. Thomas slid a document across the table. It was a printed email from Corinne to a private account, dated nearly 3 years earlier. The subject line read, "Problem neighbor action required." In the email, Corinne complained about me to someone named David, describing how I had rudely asked her to move her car at a local restaurant because it was blocking the exit. She wrote that I had embarrassed her in front of friends and was exactly the type of entitled person she disliked. I remembered the incident vaguely, a minor parking issue where I had politely asked someone to move their car so I could leave. It had lasted all of 30 seconds, and I had forgotten it immediately. She held a grudge for 3 years over a parking request, I asked incredulously. Apparently so, Thomas replied. And it gets worse. When she discovered you lived in Maple Hills after she moved here, she began documenting your property immediately, long before joining the board. Her personal files include dozens of photos of your house dating back 2.5 years. The revelation that Corinne's actions stemmed from such a trivial incident felt both absurd and chilling. Her methodical, years-long campaign of targeted harassment was difficult to comprehend. The settlement negotiations took on a different tone after this disclosure. The HOA representatives were clearly concerned about potential publicity if the full story came to light. By the end of the meeting, they had agreed to most of our terms, with some adjustments to the monetary compensation. The final agreement took shape over the next week. Complete restoration of my yard according to my specifications, using a reputable landscaper of my choice. $7,500 in compensation for emotional distress, and new HOA bylaws amendments requiring full board approval and homeowner notification for any enforcement actions. Additionally, the board agreed to conduct annual reviews of all enforcement actions to identify patterns of selective enforcement. While these negotiations were proceeding, Karen's position in the community continued to deteriorate. A special board meeting was called to address multiple complaints that had suddenly emerged from other homeowners. The meeting room was even more crowded than before. One by one, residents came forward with their stories. The Patels described how Karen had repeatedly cited them for their vegetable garden while ignoring similar gardens in other yards. An elderly resident tearfully recounted how Karen had threatened fines over a wheelchair ramp until another board member intervened. A young family detailed how Karen had photographed their children playing in their own backyard, claiming she was documenting noise violations. Karen's response to these accusations revealed a person unfamiliar with accountability. Initially, she dismissed the complaints as malicious exaggerations. When presented with her own emails and photographs as evidence, she claimed she was just doing her job. As more residents spoke, her demeanor shifted from defensive to combative. "Someone needs to maintain standards around here," she finally snapped, rising from her chair. "Do you think your property values stay high by accident? Without people like me enforcing the rules, this place would look like a slum within months." The room fell silent at her outburst. Thomas Bennett spoke quietly into the microphone. "I believe that comment speaks for itself. Is there a motion from the board?" The vote to remove Karen from the board was unanimous, including the votes of members who had previously supported her. As she gathered her things to leave, no one met her eye or offered a sympathetic word. The community had rendered its verdict. The final settlement agreement was signed the following day. As I reviewed the document formalizing the HOA's obligations to restore my property, I felt a complex mixture of vindication and exhaustion. The battle had been necessary but draining. 3 days later, a for sale sign appeared in front of Karen's house. The reconstruction of my yard began on a Monday morning in early summer. I had selected a well-respected landscaping company known for sustainable, native plant designs. Their crew arrived with detailed plans based on my photographs and garden journal, along with a truck full of mature plants that closely matched what had been destroyed. The foreman, a woman named Elena with 20 years of experience, walked the property with me before they began work. "We can make this better than it was before," she said, sketching ideas on her tablet. "The irrigation system will be completely modernized. The soil amendments will create better drainage, and these native plants will be even more sustainable than your previous selections." Over the next 2 weeks, I watched as my barren yard transformed. The crew worked methodically, laying new irrigation lines, rebuilding garden beds with improved borders, and installing a more efficient drip system for the plants. The rock garden was recreated with additional features that enhanced its natural appearance. Fresh topsoil, rich and dark, replaced the exposed clay. Neighbors stopped by regularly to observe the progress and offer encouragement. What struck me most was how the incident had changed the community dynamic. People who had previously kept to themselves now introduced themselves and engaged in conversation. There was a new awareness of the importance of community involvement and oversight.